We'll kick off and I'll introduce Tal Brewer, who's going to speak to us next. I think everyone knows Tal, who is the Professor of Philosophy at the University of Virginia and a specialist in ethics and political philosophy. And he's going to talk to us now about Eros and philosophy in the Phaedrus. Over to you, Tal. Thanks very much.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for organizing this, Fiona and Claire, and for putting together this lovely group of people. I don't like reading papers in general, and this paper will tell you why I don't like reading papers, but I'm going to read it. Sorry. Anyway, this way I think I can squeeze it into the allotted time. So here goes. Setting aside the Last Supper, the words shared that night by a handful of half-drunk Athenians have left as deep a mark on Western thought as anything ever uttered over a glass of wine. We owe our acquaintance with this conversation to Plato's Symposium, in which Plato tells us what Apollodorus tells the curious companion about what he told Glaucon a few days before about what Aristodemus told him was said many years ago by those who gathered at the house of the dramatist Agathon, who had decided to tell each other what they thought they knew of love. Actually, the chain of tellings is a bit longer, not just because I'm telling you about it here now, and you might go on to tell others, but also because the most memorable speech that night was itself a retelling by Socrates of what had been said to him many years ago by a priestess named Diotima, to whom Socrates says he owes whatever grasp he has of love. Now, I've lingered over this elaborate chain of tellings because it's central, I think, to Plato's purposes. It's meant to provide a practical illustration of the dynamics of Diotimic Eros. Diotima's central thesis is that the aim of Eros is procreation in the medium of the beautiful, and among the things we are erotically drawn to reproduce is thought in the beautiful medium of the minds and lives of our fellow human beings. Which is just what is exemplified by the dramatic structure that I just recounted. We might ask, though, why we're drawn precisely to the beautiful in our zeal to propagate the good. I'll approach this question by drawing from what is, for me at least, a beautiful little book called Eros the Bittersweet by the poet and classicist Anne Carson. One of Carson's guiding ideas is that the Greek experience of Eros centrally involves a kind of double vision. This is how she describes the experience. The difference between what is and what could be is visible. The idea is projected on a screen of the actual in a kind of stereoscopy. The two images are bound together by a current, now this is back to me, are bound together by a current of potential energy or potentiality, a suggestiveness protruding from the beloved things themselves. I've come to think that to see a thing as beautiful, at least in Platonic terms, just is to see it in the shimmering light of its potentiality or of the perfected form to which it owes its existence. Eros then can be thought of as a longing, as drawn to the beautiful precisely because that's where it can do its work. It's a longing to bring the things of this world of becoming, into a more complete form of being. Put another way, Eros is longing to participate in the work or the play of creation or maybe procreation. And since I'm speaking to philosophers, perhaps I can convey the experience of erotic stereoscopy by considering the emergence of fresh understanding. As Carson points out, the birth of new insight can have what she calls an electrification that's quite like the electrification involved in falling in love. Both rivet our attention with anticipatory excitement about what promises to emerge. New thoughts begin in embryonic inklings, whose content remains indistinct yet suggestive. And it's only by trying to see more clearly what's revealing itself in these inklings that we come to see things more clearly. This is, I think, the stereoscopy of intellectual, and it's perhaps what induces Plato to suggest that philosophy is itself an erotic activity, that it is perhaps better called erosophy. Now, the Diotimic ladder of erotic ascent has come in for fierce criticism. Two lines of objection have been particularly influential. The first is ontological. It's said to posit a realm of intelligible entities in which we have no good reason to believe. And the second is ethical. It's said to displace whatever love we might have for our fellow human beings by redirecting our love towards an imagined otherworldly realm. As against the charge of ontological extravagance, I would suggest that whatever may be true of other things, it is true at least of human beings, that we cannot fully apprehend them unless we see them stereoscopically. This, I think, is closely connected with what John was just talking about under the heading of the incompleteness of human beings. A lion can be a good lion without appreciating and striving to exemplify the relevant goodness, but a human being cannot be an ideally good human being without striving to appreciate and exemplify the relevant goodness, which can be quite opaque. Erotic stereoscopy then is arguably essential to full apprehension of the properly human form of life. I like the way Bob Dylan once put it. He said, "He not busy being born is busy dying." That's a thought that will resonate a little bit more loudly, perhaps by the end of the paper. What about the charge that Diotima Eros assigns to others a transitory, instrumental value as mere rungs on the ladder to perfection? Some of Diotima's words do invite this charge, but we should attend to all of what she says and its connection, at which I was just, gesturing, to what she does. One thing she emphasizes is that Eros can express itself in efforts to give birth in the beautiful medium of the minds and lives of others. And this appears, as I was suggesting, to be precisely what she was doing in the medium of Socrates' mind by sharing her insights into love. Her reproductive efforts bear further fruit at Agathon's gathering when Socrates seeds the minds of others with these same insights. Socrates is giving Diotima grandchildren, among them Apollodorus, who gives her the great-grandchild Aristodemus, or Aristodemus's thoughts, whom we overhear Aristodemus giving her great-great-grandchildren. Indeed, Plato, it seems to me, is going to great lengths to highlight the transgenerational fecundity of Diotima's thoughts, which is to say, their resounding success as erotic acts, as she construes erotic acts. It won't do then to think of Diotima as detached from her fellow human beings and regarding them as dispensable rungs in the ladder of enlightenment that she herself is in the midst of. Diotima suggests by word and deed that we are to help each other up this ladder so that whatever grasp of the good we have obtained might benefit others, and if we're lucky in love, might resound across the generations. Now, if this is Diotima Eros, it does not seem to assign merely instrumental value to others. It would be a mistake, though, to suppose that it will leave no one feeling used. A clear counterexample to this optimistic hypothesis arrives toward the end of the symposium in the person of Alcibiades, who barges drunkenly into Agathon's courtyard just as Socrates is finishing his retelling of Diotima's speech and accepts the challenge of describing the peculiar character of Socrates. Wealthy young men flock to Socrates, he tells us, spellbound by his words, and many are deeply smitten. As Alcibiades explains, when philosophy seizes upon the mind of a young man of caliber, it clings more fiercely than any snake and makes him do and say all sorts of things. What it makes Alcibiades do is to become the ardent suitor of a physically unattractive older man when it's the Athenian custom for the elder lover to do the pursuing of a physically attractive youth and the younger beloved to resist. Yet Alcibiades does not succeed in seducing Socrates, at least not in the conventional sense. He therefore takes himself to have been toyed with and cruelly spurned. And he thinks that others have had similar experiences. In fact, he names names. Now, Socrates credits Diotima with teaching him the art of love. Some commentators have suggested that he has instead learned to avoid human love in the vain hope of loving something perfect and eternal. But before we opt for this damning construal, let's listen to a bit more of Alcibiades' tale. Let's consider what he says of Socrates' response to his proposal, to Alcibiades' proposal to offer sexual gratification in exchange for the sort of philosophical conversation that will make Alcibiades a better and wiser man. What Socrates says first is that if Alcibiades is right, that Socrates can make him virtuous and wise, He's wrong to suppose that mere sex would be fair compensation. Yet, he adds, Alcibiades might be wrong about what Socrates can do. And in any case, he says, the thing for them to do is to put their heads together with respect to this and every other question before them, and to do whatever seems best on reflection. Now, Alcibiades reads this as rejection, but why? It looks as if Alcibiades has offered sex as payment for Socrates' help in living more wisely, and Socrates has countered by offering the requested help for free. Arguably, it's Socrates who has been rejected. He has made what is, in Diotemic terms, an erotic proposal, and it is refused with a vengeance. Indeed, Alcibiades tells us that when he hears Socrates talking about how best to live, he blocks his ears and he runs away as if he were escaping the sirens. This casts fresh light on Alcibiades' effort to, quote, capture, that's his word, the man he thinks he loves. It now appears, at least arguably, to be a wish to neutralize and discredit, or should we say defrock, an externalized representative of his own spurned conscience. We might then wonder whether Alcibiades' attraction to Socrates, which undeniably counts as erotic in our sense, also counts as love. And this might make us wonder whether, in stripping our idea of the erotic of concern for the beloved's growth, we've lost hold of the idea that Eros is a kind of love, or better, we've lost touch with the special kind of love that Eros, or at least Diotemic Eros, is. Now, this idea that love, or Eros, essentially involves an openness to and ardor for growth is central to Plato's other magisterial dialogue on Eros, the Phaedrus. Partly under Anne Carson's influence, I've come to read this dialogue around the hinge of a passage whose meaning is easily and often lost in translation. In this passage, Socrates suggests that to live without erotic love is to consign oneself to a mortal or deathly moderation, one whose benefits are marked by a mortal or deathly economizing. It is, as Carson puts it, to practice an economy of death. Now, early in the dialogue, Phaedrus reads Socrates a handwritten version of Lysias's speech on Eros. What Lysias argues is that one should never choose a sexual partner who is gripped by Eros, partly because Eros unhinges our capacity for calculated deliberation, rendering our commitments undependable. Later, when the conversation turns to the assessment of Lysias's speech, Socrates asks Phaedrus to reread the first lines. Here they are. You know about my affairs, and you've heard how I think they benefit us both when these things work out. Nor do I expect to fail to get what I ask for just because I don't happen to be in love with you. When lovers lose their passion, they come to regret whatever goods they may have conferred, and so on. Socrates' complaint is this. He, Lysias, doesn't start at the beginning, but at the end, swimming through the speech upstream on his back, beginning with what a lover would say to his darling after his love is gone. Further, the parts of the speech are put together in a random order. Every speech, Socrates says, like a living creature, should be put together with its own body, so that it's not without a head or without a foot, but has a middle and extremities, written in such a way that its parts fit together and form a whole. By contrast, the parts of Lysias's speech seem to have been poured out in a heap. They have no life. There are here two criticisms, one of the substance of the argument and one of the method. And the two shortcomings are joined at the hip in the sense that they exhibit the same deficiency of character. This is just what we should expect Socrates to suggest, given his conviction that the proper way to think is erosophical, because this conviction implies that those who are deaf to the call of Eros, as Lysias professes to be, are therefore unsuited for insightful thinking. The methodological critique is familiar from other Platonic dialogues. The rhetorician, and that's what Lysias is by trade, misunderstands the telos of the human power of the word or of logos. Its proper use is to rise toward clearer understanding of fundamentally important matters. The rhetorician uses it instead as a tool of persuasion, picking his thesis with a view to what he wants others to believe and choosing arguments to inculcate that belief. In this case, presumably the advantage Lysias seeks is reliable sexual access to Phaedrus. And he hopes to secure this advantage by convincing Phaedrus that it's best to confer sexual favors upon an accomplished non-lover like himself. This in turn requires the writing of a speech in which this thesis is set out, followed by a list of considerations that lend it an air of plausibility. The speech is assembled for an instrumental purpose, does not record, nor does it tend to foster one of those erotically electrified moments that Anne Carson speaks of, in which a dimly perceived truth comes into greater clarity. The objection to the substance of the speech is that Lysias could, quite literally starts at the end of the affair. He starts at the end of the thought and he starts at the end of the affair, thereby presuming that those who have not yet been swept up in it, the affair, can foresee how they will look back on it once it ends. What this ignores is that Eros essentially involves an openness to what exceeds and might at any moment decenter our sense of the nature and value of what we're up to, including the relationships into which it sweeps us. That is, it ignores the dynamics of erotic stereoscopy, which is precisely what the rhetorical use of logos also overlooks. The Phaedrus then can be read as a global critique of a sober, calculative, Eros refusing form of thought and action, or more generally, form of life. If we think of agency as a matter of remaking the world in the image of an antecedently prefigured end, then all surprise must be traced either to the bulkiness of the world or to agential failure, never to agential growth. This is a point that I think way back in the day I owe to Chuck Matthews, who put it so beautifully to me on the downtown mall many, many years ago. This is a recipe for a mortal economy in the sense that it imagines the self as frozen and succeeds in its calculative enterprises only if the self obligingly remains still, stunted. Whereas in a healthy mode of living, we're often catching up with the meanings of our own words and actions, attempting to uncover the obscure yet tantalizing promise that has drawn us to them. To plan comprehensively for the future, as if this progressive unveiling were not a part of living, is to treat yourself as something uninsole, dead to the possibility of growth. It is, as it were, to turn living flesh to stone, which was, or to metal, which was the special power or curse of Midas. So it's quite apt that Plato turns to the myth of Midas to convey the flaws in Lysias's thought and seductive techniques. What Socrates says is that Lysias's speech is just like the epigram on King Midas's tomb. Here's the verse. A bronze maiden I am, on Midas remains I lie. So long as rain falls and mighty oaks grow, stationed here by this much lamented tomb, I announce to travelers by that Midas is buried here. The maiden is cast in metal. The oaks grow, the rain falls, but she's frozen stiff. And her words, like those of Lysias, lack definite temporality. And that's the point that Socrates really wants to draw our attention to. You can read the lines in any order you like. You could try it out later. I think they're on the handout. And there's no loss of coherence. They lack the organic structure of a living being, an attribute that in this rare case makes them apt because it helps them to manifest the tragic flaw of the man beneath, the one who took the life of everyone and everything he touched. This, Socrates is indirectly suggesting, is the fate Lysias is offering to share with Phaedrus. Its presence in Lysias is already visible. His speech lacks organic unity. He's touched it, and it's a dead letter, a topic to which Socrates returns at the end of the dialogue when he tells us, in effect, that all written speeches are dead letters. I mentioned that my talk would tell you why I shouldn't read talks, and here we are. The true dialectician goes about his work in living conversation. leading another human being in a maieutic spirit of midwifery, to the point where new thoughts take shape. These discourses, he says, yield legitimate children, that's a quote, in the form of awakenings in the soul of another. Next to them, all other discourses are of little worth. They lack the erotic power to give birth to children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Perhaps the most fundamental disagreement between Alcibiades and Socrates concerns what it means for the lover to gain possession of the beloved. Alcibiades is working with a familiar idea of possession, one centered on exclusive sexual access and policed by jealousy. Diotima Eros, too, aims at a kind of possession, she tells us, namely possession of the good forever. That this is an odd idea of possession should be clear from the fact that its consummate objects are ideas which by nature are unsuited for exclusivity. Its oddness becomes even more pronounced when Diotima suggests that we mortals make our ideas permanent by passing them on to others so that our ideas can outlive us. This is, to say the least, an unusual idea of permanent possession. One wants to say that it has been shorn of any taint of possessiveness. The fecundity of Diotima's thought exemplifies an economy that stands in telling contrast to Lysias's mortal economy. Perhaps we could call it an erotic economy, or an economy of love, or maybe we should call it an economy of birth, in contrast to what Carson calls an economy of death. This economy trades in goods like wisdom and virtue and intellectual insight. Contemporary economists call such goods non-rivalrous, but this term undersells their sociability, since their possession by one does not interfere with, but positively enhances their value to others. The more widely they're shared, the greater the range of valuable interactivities they make possible, and the more we can extend and perfect them. We might call this welcome source of externalities a comedy of the commons, as opposed to what environmentalists speak of under the heading of a tragedy of the commons. Then we could read the Symposium as just such a comedy, one that's interrupted and sent in a less celebratory direction by Alcibiades, who sees the world through a jealous and acquisitive economic lens. When students come to my office hours to talk, I often get the feeling that they're torn between these two economic paradigms. They're bitten by philosophy, or many of them are, especially those who actually come to talk to me. But they have at least one eye on career-based ends. And many of them go through college without any serious reassessment of these ends, swimming upstream on their backs through the texts we ask them to read. Yet if we don't induce our students to seriously rethink their life economies, and if their rethinkings do not in their turn yield children and grandchildren, what exactly is our calling? And if there's failure here, what is its source? The wider ethos of the university, our departments of mortal economics and their allies in the professional schools, the wider cultural currents that shape our sense of what we might hope to bring to and receive from our fellow human beings, our ways of practicing and teaching the humanities? I suspect the answer is all of the above, but I've gone on long enough. It's time to put down this written speech, which has been condemning itself pretty loudly, and let the orosophy begin. Thank you.
Brilliant, fantastic. Thank you, Tal, very much indeed. That was just fabulous. I think we probably need to catch our breath after that for a minute. Okay, so we're now at 5 to 4. I think we've got just 5 minutes, strictly speaking, to raise issues and ask questions that I guess we may want to pick up later in the afternoon. So do wave at me if you'd like to. Yeah, Fiona, please go ahead.
Tal, I thought that was just so inspirational. Thank you. It reminded me a bit what you were saying towards the end of an essay by David Foster Wallace called "This is Water" that I was discussing yesterday with some students, but that's just a little aside. I've been trying to get clear about the relation between Diotima and Alcibiades for a long time. And I'd read essays by people like Martha Nussbaum, for example, who talk of the way in which Socrates seems a bit like a sphere, and Alcibiades is trying to open him up, and Alcibiades is much more open and vulnerable, and we're led to believe that Alcibiades is the one who knows how to love and Socrates doesn't. He's a bit like a form. And I always felt that there was something misguided about that interpretation, but what you're saying here, it just provides a much more convincing way of understanding what's going on in that dialogue. So thank you for that. It's not really a question, it's just an observation. I thought your interpretation was so fertile and helpful to me as well.
It was Nussbaum's essay after a couple of readings that induced me to go in this different direction. I didn't think but it took me a while to learn how to say what I wanted to say in a different, in opposition to that reading of it. But thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Fiona, very much. Anybody else at this stage? Chuck, go ahead, please.
Al, that was wonderful as ever, and I miss being able to hang out on the downtown mall
Me too.
with you. We'll do it before too long. I was also thinking not just of Nussbaum and some of the other stuff, but Lear's line about Socrates and Alcibiades, that the thing that Socrates basically tells Alcibiades is that he can go fuck himself, right? And I've always liked that in fact it's not just about an economy of death, but there's a kind of autoeroticism about Alcibiades' aim, which doesn't actually even engage the other. And I just want to know what you think about that.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have a quick response to it, but I'll have to go. You mean Jonathan Lear, not Gabriel Lear?
Right. No, Jonathan Lear in
I don't remember that.
The essay in Open Mind.
I'm gonna have to look at that.
It's incredible. You're like, just Lear straight along, and then suddenly you're like, wait a minute, this just moved from PG-13 to NC-17 very quickly here. And it was good though. It was a very clear,
good line, and I'll have to think about that.
Yeah. Okay, sorry, that was all.
Thanks, Chuck. Anybody else at this stage? I think I'd quite like to ask about stereoscopy, which is just fascinating stuff, Tal, later on. But maybe at this stage now, it's just turning 4 o'clock. We'll move on to the next speaker, who is my very good friend and colleague, Chris Insole, who's here with me at the University of Durham, where he's Professor of Philosophical Theology and Ethics. The writer of 3 books on Kant now, the most recent, Kant and the Divine, From Contemplation to the Moral Law, which was published this year. And Chris is now going to talk to us about Kant, Free Desire, Kant on Happiness and God. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks so much. And thank you to Claire and Fiona for this wonderful event and having me along. So I need to start with the big picture before getting closer to the target of this discussion, Kant on desire. Necessarily, there'll be quite a lot of assertion in setting up this big picture. I don't see any way around this, but I have shown my working elsewhere, and I can point you to this if that would be helpful. So the big picture. Kant thinks always in a way that's big and binary. His philosophy tends to lead us to a crossroads where he finds that everything, created and uncreated, is either this way or that way, where what is offered is an entire package, a whole and encompassing worldview. For our purposes today, the options are these. We either live in a world of mechanistic determinism, where freedom and morality are impossible, or we live in a moral world where freedom is possible. The former, mechanistic world, is a mere desert, entirely without value. The latter, moral world, contains the only thing that constitutes the inner value of the world, and this is freedom. And freedom means setting ends for yourself without being impacted upon by anything external to you. Freedom is the inner value of the world, Kant writes, and if there is no total and unalloyed freedom, the entire world, even with all its splendor and beauty, would lack value. Fortunately, Kant finds that we can and indeed must rationally believe, without knowing, that the entire and whole world is undergirded by freedom and not mechanism. and so is a world with value. Why can we rationally believe this? Well, because belief in freedom is not ruled out by what we know theoretically, and our enjoying such freedom is the only way to support and ground the whole project of being moral. Reason for Kant is a bigger category than knowledge. There's far more that we can have rational beliefs about than we can know about. We're not very good at knowing things, but we're pretty good at believing in things rationally. This wide scope of rational believing links up with another fundamental principle of Kant's way of thinking, which is this: thinking about the conditions of possibility of something can expand your knowledge and your set of rational beliefs. So consider, if you have a rational belief in something, you can then ask, what else must be the case, or what else do I need to believe in order to make this possible? You then have warrant for affirming, for holding for true, whatever comes out of this conceptual investigation. Sure, you might not know it, but as we've just seen, knowledge is not everything. There's a caveat here. Anything you come up with must not contradict something that you know, but this is a fairly minimal test, precisely because we don't know very much. Why is freedom the only thing of value? This is a good question, which in a way, in the end, Kant doesn't really answer. It is his silent axiom, rather like the silence of St. Thomas identified by Joseph Pieper, which in Aquinas's case is the doctrine of creation ex nihilo. Kant becomes convinced about freedom constituting the inner value of the world in the 1760s and 70s. In his early thought, he doesn't think in this way at all. There's a lot more one can say here, but that had better do for now. What fundamentally matters for Kant, therefore, is free end setting, setting ends in freedom. Where do we encounter this self who acts in proper freedom? Kant finds nowhere in the world as it appears in spatial and temporal terms. The only self and freedom we encounter in our spatio-temporal experience is a self subjected to external causes. We never actually experience our own freedom in our empirical biographies, which are a sort of moving image of our own eternity, enjoyed by our proper selves existing outside of space and time, in the noumenal or the moral realm. Space and time are pervasive and unavoidable features of our reception of the world as it is in itself, which world includes ourselves as we really are, our proper selves, as Kant puts it. We are only ever an appearance of ourselves to ourselves. The appearance is not an illusion, rather, it is the well-founded phenomenon of what we truly are, but it is not a direct disclosure of it. Only philosophy can give us the consolation that a sense we sometimes have as of being free in thought, moral action, and aesthetic appreciation genuinely goes all the way down into the heart of reality. I receive Kant in this respect as a sort of Platonist, and I don't think Platonism at best is dualistic or remote, or that it posits two worlds. Rather, Platonism, and I think Kant, attends to the simultaneously veiling and unveiling disclosure of fundamental reality in degrees of intensity, according to the limited extent of our cognitive capacity. This gives us what we need, I hope, to turn to Kant on desire. A key interpretive principle in reading Kant is to understand that many key terms have a dual use. They have an application in the realm of spatial temporal appearances and an application in the fundamental noumenal realm of freedom, which we are entitled to believe in. Even skilled Kant commentators get a twist here, in my view, basing statements about Kant's negative attitude to happiness and desire on what is in fact Kant's negative attitude to the phenomenal appearance of happiness and desire. Such negative assessments of desire are easy to find and familiar. For example, the moral human being claims for himself a will which lets nothing be put to his account that belongs merely to his desires and inclinations. But here is the rub. Kant's objection here is not to desire across the board and in every sense, but to deterministic and unfree desire. When Kant is looking for that which has unconditioned value, for that which is good without limit, he considers a whole range of candidates as they appear in space and time, and finds them all lacking, not because of their content, which can be the idea of God or even respect for the moral law, as well as sensuous impulses, but because of the method of their reception, which is temporal and therefore mechanistic and unfree. Consider the line from the groundwork where Kant lists unsuccessful candidates for that which is good without limit. Kant rules out, it's true, happiness, desire, and inclinations, but also the idea of rational nature and the idea of moral perfection. With respect to that which appears in space and time, desire does indeed have a negative connotation because it is the mechanism of being impacted upon externally and deterministically, whatever the content of this desire, including again a desire for the moral law. All that matters from the moral perspective is that the event, the desire to follow the moral law or to contemplate the perfection of God, impacts upon us and so destroys our freedom by moving the will rather than the will moving itself. Such a desire, however elevated the object, Kant writes, would at bottom be nothing better than the freedom of a turnspit, which, when once it is wound up, also accomplishes its movements of itself. The implication of all this is that any object external to our will that might be presented to the will, no matter how elevated, even if it is the uncreated good itself or the moral law, is infected with determinism, simply by virtue of impacting upon us at all. Because for Kant, freedom is total or it is nothing. It is the determinism of what Kant calls the lower faculty of desire that is the problem, and not straightforwardly the category of desire. How do we know this? Well, because Kant talks about desire in another sense. Free desire, which pertains to the intelligible and noumenal realm of freedom, which we must, Kant thinks, rationally believe in. In the third critique, Kant talks of how the free human being should be understood as the final end of creation with respect to the faculty of desire. Kant immediately makes the necessary qualifications, writing that this is not with respect to that which makes him dependent on nature through sensible impulses, nor in relation to what he receives and enjoys. Rather, it is the value that he alone can give to himself and which consists in what he does, in how and in accordance with which principles he acts, not as a link in nature, but in the freedom of his faculty of desire. That is, a good will is that alone by means of which his existence can have an absolute value and in relation to which the existence of the world can have a final end. The notion of free desire is nothing less for Kant than the freedom of the will, which is a notion that he develops and celebrates across his critical work. It is the free desire that belongs to the proper self, conceived of beyond and prior to our spatial and temporal reception of ourselves. Because Kant writes, as a human being, the proper self is only the appearance of himself. There is much more one can say, of course, but let's say that I'm right about this aspect of Kant's thought. What then? Well, first of all, I'll say something about the relationship between free desire for Kant and morality and happiness. Then I'll turn to the wider question of what we might think about such a conception of desire. First of all, how does morality relate to free desire? The brisk answer, I think, is that morality is the same thing as free desire, or rather, it is free desire taken to the maximum and made harmonious, universal, and plenitudinous. This is why Kant's claim that freedom and morality are the same is, I think, a correct account of his position, because morality just is the maximal and harmonious state of all possible end setting, happening reciprocally and plenitudinously. This is the kingdom of ends. Commentators focus excessively on the universalization criteria, but when you read Kant extensively, what emerges is that he talks just as much about harmony, with a significant interest also in a sort of plenitude of harmonious end setting, the realization, as Kant puts it, of all sorts of possible ends. In relation to happiness, there is again a dual use of this concept, corresponding to the distinction between the higher, free, and lower, unfree faculties of desire. Sensuous happiness for Kant is not the same as the deep happiness of the highest good. Where the former is the satisfaction of a phenomenal and determined inclination, the latter is a consequence of the realization of all universalizable and harmonious ends. It is the deep happiness of the highest good that Kant addresses in all the passages cited above, where happiness is described as the consequence of living in a moral world. It is this happiness that Kant defines in the second critique when he writes that happiness is the state of a rational being in the world in the whole of whose existence everything goes according to his wish and his will. In contrast to the unfree happiness that is the satisfaction of an inclination which leads only to unstable and transient pleasure. True happiness is what would inevitably emerge if we were to live in a fully realized kingdom of ends, where everyone always acted in a way that could be universalized harmoniously. I want now to address two objections or adverse reactions that I think are likely to arise in relation to the worldview as put forward by Kant. Perhaps they've arisen in you. The first objection is this, that desire without attraction to something other, and without receptivity to this other, is meaningless or hardly desire at all. Now, I'm not a Kantian, and I'm not going to defend Kant. In the end, I'm far more of a Platonist than a Kantian. Indeed, I find it obvious and intuitive, experientially unavoidable, and indeed marvelous, that desire is indexed to receptivity, to attraction, to otherness, to lack, and to vulnerability. Nonetheless, I want to offer some framing, perhaps ameliorating reflections on the picture that Kant unveils for us. My way into addressing the first objection is to ask this: what sort of desire has no external object? The immediate answer, readily available to Kant, is divine desire. God's own self-enjoyment on a classical account does not depend upon an external object or anything outside of God. Throughout his life, in his early and late philosophy, Kant writes about this divine desire, talking about the divine ideas, which are the storehouse of all possibility. Kant writes that the possibilities of things themselves, which are given through the divine nature, harmonize with God's great desire, and that goodness and perfection themselves consist in this harmony. God has, Kant writes, the highest desire for the unity, harmony, and order found in the possibilities of things. In the 1780s, the critical Kant describes the creation as a diffusion of divine self-delight. God's well-pleasedness with himself, he writes, is such that God cannot be thought to shut himself up within himself. Rather, God produces the highest good beyond himself, just by his consciousness of his all-sufficiency. What emerges then is that the sort of happiness we enjoy in the kingdom of ends is itself a type of divine happiness. With Aquinas, we participate in divine desire by loving and knowing God in the beatific vision. With Kant, the participation in divinity is not through loving and knowing, for Kant something external, but through an immanent and free imitation and enactment of the divine, through a participation in a harmonious and plenitudinous end setting, and through membership in a community of rational end setting, a systematic union, as Kant describes it. Deep happiness and delight is the necessary consequence of being in this state, which brings us to a second anxiety, that whatever we might say about God, a notion of desire without receptivity and vulnerability, at least for human beings, has something appalling about it, marking a disturbing transition from thinking about desire as love to desire as power. In responses to various presentations I've made on Kant over time, I often find this point delivered sometimes with a real anger and vehemence. Again, I'm not a Kantian, and I do embrace receptivity and vulnerability, but nonetheless, I do want to ask, what might we say to nuance our understanding of Kant on this point? I would begin by unsettling the way the challenge is presented, which is to assume a moral self who then forms an attitude towards other selves and decides on principle not to be receptive. This misses its target because at the most fundamental level, I think, Kant's approach is deeply impersonal. It is the end setting that matters, not that the end set is mine or yours. I should have an equidistant attitude to my own end setting as to yours. There's a sort of unselfing, self-transcending participation in the structure of freedom and reason as such. I find something of this impersonality beautifully expressed in Simone Weil, who I find deeply and precisely Kantian on my reading of what this means. For Kant, being moral involves participating in that which has unconditioned value, which is end setting, which is freedom, which is reason. There are two features of Weil's philosophy that are relevant here: the impersonal nature of truth and justice, and an aversion to annihilating force. Both, I think, represent deep Kantian concerns. First of all, on the impersonal nature of truth and justice, Weil observes that if a child is doing a sum wrong, and the mistake bears the stamp of his personality, if he does the sum exactly right, his personality does not enter into it at all. Truth and beauty, Weil writes, dwell on the level of the impersonal and anonymous. Perfection is impersonal. Our personality is the part of us which belongs to error and sin. The whole effort of the mystic has always been to become such that there is no part left in his soul to say, I. Weil states that when the infliction of evil provokes a sorrowful surprise, a cry of sorrowful surprise from the depths of the soul, it is not a personal thing. Injury to the personality and its desires is not sufficient to evoke it, but only and always a sense of contact with injustice through pain. It is always in the last of men, as in Christ himself, an impersonal protest. What is sacred in every man, Vail asserts, is not the contingent features of his personal personality. It is he, the whole of him, the arms, the eyes, the thoughts, everything. Not without infinite scruple would I touch anything of this. Approaches that descend from Kant tend to be associated with exaggerated notions of autonomy, freedom, and control. But it's possible to see in Kant a profound awareness and concern with our vulnerability. So immersive is our vulnerability and the obstacles to rational self-government that even the structures of space and time themselves are an annihilating threat to our freedom, or they would be if they went all the way down into the creation. Vail also has this searing sense of the annihilating potential of mechanical force on human beings. She writes, "To define force, it is that X that turns anybody who is subjected to it into a thing. Exercised to the limit, it turns man into a thing in the most literal sense. It makes a corpse out of him. Something was here, and the next minute there is nobody here at all." Consider Kant's famous line from the Second Critique, engraved on his tombstone. "Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and reverence. The more often and more steadily one reflects on them, the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me." The tombstone epitaph is typical in cutting off the quotation at this point, which can leave the impression that the reference to the starry heavens is rather dreamy and romantic. There is a hard edge to the starry heavens, as Kant goes on to reflect. The view of a countless multitude of worlds annihilates, as it were, my importance as an animal creature, which after it has been for a short time provided with vital force, one knows not how, must give back to the planet, a mere speck in the universe, the matter from which it came. The aversion to receptivity arises then from an aversion to annihilating force. And the free desire of end setting is a participation in impersonal, unselfing perfection. The proper self, the never known companion who is with us all our lives, basks in the supersensible light of the freedom which is reason, which is morality. And put in mind of Vail's line, it is the light falling continually from heaven, which alone gives a tree the energy to send powerful roots deep into the earth. The tree is really rooted in the sky. When I set Kant's vision out so briefly, relatively anyway, it seems so strange and perhaps a little cold and vertiginous. Perhaps because I've spent too many years with my hostage taker, I don't find it so. I find it a moving, beautiful, consoling worldview, which gives rise to a sort of spiritual and expansive way of life. Not the one I lead at all, but one whose living pulse I've felt and been grateful for. But it would take too long to explain why this is so, and perhaps in the end, I couldn't very well explain it. In summary, although Kant is opposed to heteronymous desires, he has a category of free desire, which involves our capacity for a self-transcending participation in reason as such, which is our highest good constituting true happiness. This illuminates a distinction, perhaps, between two conceptions of desiring God, either through contemplating and loving God, or by being God, and in some sense enacting divinity in our self-transcendence. Thanks.
Fabulous, thank you, Chris. Thank you very much indeed. As always, beautiful and lucid. Okay, so we've got 10 minutes now for questions and comments about Chris's paper. Wave at me.
Thank you, Chris. Really enjoyed that. Thank you. Just, it's funny that you ended up saying, oh, maybe you'll think this is sort of not very appealing or something like that. I wasn't really thinking that, but what I was wondering was, how would this way of thinking translate into anything lived, anything existential? It seems easier to connect with Tal's Platonist view, for example, or with John's talk, a sense of what it would be to inhabit this way of being. There's a kind of experiential resonance with those ways of thinking, and so I agree that Kant's way of thinking is just more sort of strange. As I say, not because I have particular philosophical or theological objections to it, but just I find it harder to imagine what it would be to actually live out that way of thinking. And it sounds like that's something you have thought about a bit as well. So I'm interested in what you'd have to say about that.
Yeah, no, thanks, Claire. It's a great question. I have thought about it. Not necessarily come up with very much, but I think it's. I get the clearest sense of it, say, when I read in a linear way the whole of the groundwork or the second critique. Those two texts in particular, I find that there's almost an intent to pedagogically transform the reader. So you're taken on a journey where various candidates are offered up. Is this good without limit? So there's a sort of exploration of false resting points, and then they're destabilized. A bit like, reminds me of the sort of experience of the daimon in the Platonic dialogues. That's destabilized, and you're led on to another thing. Then so it's a sort of ascesis, a removal of that which is false, a false resting place, and then Kant ends up leaning into a space of freedom, which is identical with reason, which is morality, which is, in some sense, a mystery for Kant, and he's willing to name it that, incomprehensible, but you can comprehend the need for it. So, but in terms of spiritual, I mean, the spiritual practice can't just be reading the groundwork every day, can it? I mean, it has to be lived in a more extended way, I know that. And I suppose the other glimpse I have out of it is that it perhaps depends on where you think the threat is, because it's a very threatening picture of space and time in our experience of it, that it's so and there I fundamentally disagree with Kant. You want to rejoice more in spatiality and temporality and find in it more truth and hope. But if you had that picture of it, this is why I think he's really not a Promethean figure. It's more like Atlas or something, struggling to hold things up. That if it's so threatening, what can you do to preserve your hope and your consolation? And then I think it's a way of seizing the sorts of experiences that Kant seizes on, experiences as of freedom, because we never directly experience freedom, but we have something which is like freedom. So we have it when we overcome a moral obstacle. We have it in thought itself. We have it in aesthetic appreciation of beauty. So I suppose it's a sort of consolation, a comfort, a reassuring that in spite of the mechanism of space and time, the sense we have as of being free does indeed go all the way down. So it's perhaps a bit of a remnant of hope in the midst of something quite bleak, and I wouldn't share the bleakness. Yeah, that's all I've got at the moment.
Yeah. No.
Oh, thanks, Chris. That was wonderful. And when I first read the paper a few days ago when you sent it, it just reminded me of all of the Levinasian themes that I was going to be talking about as well. And I just wondered where it leaves the discussion that I had with Sarah after my talk about Eros and agape, because Kant is pretty much down on sexual love from what I've read. And I just wonder whether you think that there's a very similar anthropology going on, the idea of human beings being pretty sinful and sexual desire as being something egoistic and possessive. He uses that horrible image of sucking the lemon dry when you're with somebody. And if you factor into all of that, his misgivings about space and time, then I guess the very idea of relating to another human being has to be pretty problematic and something to be avoided at all costs.
Well, I suppose the kingdom of ends is the sort of the end point, the highest good, is intrinsically communal. It couldn't possibly be individualistic because it involves a harmony and a plenitude of end setters in relation. So there's got to be a way. Kant distinguishes between a community and a subordination. And the kingdom of ends is a community where there is no subordination. So there is a type of relationship, but I agree it's outside of space and time, so it's rather weird to work out how it then unfolds in the world of appearance, except that we know that when things are disturbed in our empirical biographies, it relates to a fundamental distortion in our own use of freedom and that of others. I suppose with Eros and Agape, I suppose you'd have to say that both of these would have a kind of phenomenal appearance. One isn't straightforwardly better than the other, but the test would be always the test of harmony, plenitude, universalization. I really dislike Kant's Metaphysics of Morals, the 1790s text, where he tries to apply his fundamental principles to sort of contexts, and some of the examples are kind of grim that you point to.
Oh,
but I think
really
you could have the same, sorry, go on.
No, that's a really interesting idea if you could make a distinction between Eros and Agape as they appear and Eros and Agape as they are in themselves, particularly if you want a conception of God which would somehow coordinate those two dimensions of love.
Yeah. Yes. He does make a distinction between pathological love and moral love. And moral love is what's possible in the freedom of ends, but pathological love is this sort of heteronymous being driven by impulses. But he doesn't write much about love, it's true. That's one of the worries, I think, that people have, that there's the transition from desire as love to desire as willing, which leads to Nietzsche, and that's a bad thing if you're worried about Nietzsche. Yeah.
Tal, please go ahead.
Yeah, Chris, I love the talk, and it made me head over to my my bookcase just next to us and grab my groundwork, because there's one passage that I thought I remembered, and I've just found it, that I wonder how it fits into your reading. I'm sure you've thought about it, because it's front and center here and early in groundwork 2. Even the Holy One of the Gospel must first be compared with our ideal of moral perfection before he's recognized as such. Even he says of himself, and so on and on. But further down, imitation has no place at all in moral matters. So that was, I thought I heard you think, sort of suggesting that there's a kind of an imitation of divinity in our, in our answering to the desire that binds us to the moral law. And this passage seems to at least stand in the way of some readings with that suggestion. I wondered how you position this, or understand it.
Thanks, Tal. Great question, and I loved your paper. It's fantastic. Well, I think it's more at that point, Kant's considering, he's gone through various candidates which are obviously unpromising, like sensuous impulses or honor and rewards. It's clear it's not that. And then there's a suggestion that it might be an attraction to the idea of moral perfection itself. Mm-hmm. And that's where that passage comes. And he says, no, it can't be that either, because an attraction, an imitation based on attraction, is a heteronomously determined desire, just like everything else that appears. So whatever else you might say about it, it can't be that which is good without limit. Does that interfere with the deeper thing I'm trying to say? I don't think so, because it's not an imitation of divinity as an external object, an example, a paradigm. It's an enactment of divinity. And what do I mean by that? I'm interested in the way in which, say, in the early Kant, he describes God, the Godhead, as it were, as a harmonious, a place, a conceptual place where there's a sort of all possible realities are harmoniously instantiated and realized. And in his later thought, the way he characterizes the kingdom of ends as a state where all possible ends are harmoniously willed. So my suggestion is that there's a sort of a change of key from major to minor. It's not contemplating the divine, but it's enacting something like divinity in enacting all possible harmonious ends. Kant never quite puts it like that. I mean, to be clear, I suppose I've been trying to work through the sort of thing that Kant scholars, and not just Kant scholars, say at conferences, and it's suggestive, but never quite worked through, which is there's something divine about Kant's notion of reason. I think that's right. And so in what sense? And it's the claim that it involves harmony, plenitude, order, where being involved in that harmony and plenitude and order intrinsically brings delight and happiness.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We've just turned 4:30, so I think, Claire, we're going to have a break now for half an hour or so.